So today we are just doing a recap of Lecture 3 where we looked at exploring reputation. So we're starting to think about a little bit more about the specific reputation side of the module and again thinking about still how this interfaces with the brand. So we're just going to recap what we covered in the lecture. So what is reputation? Thinking about some of the influences on reputation, and then considering what does this mean from a brand perspective. So you remember that in the lecture we talked about VW and the nature of their kind of errors that they've made around the emissions scandal. And we noted that this was particularly problematic in terms of reputation. Not only because they'd misled consumers, which is never a good thing, and also regulators and other stakeholders, but because this was done intentionally. So sometimes we might suffer issues in terms of our reputation or damage to reputation due to problems out of our control. But where this is something that could have been avoided because it was done on purpose, it kind of makes it all the more problematic. Now, we look at crisis in particular in a separate lecture later in the module, but this can be hugely problematic and damaging for brands and their subsequent reputations. Okay, so let's start off by talking about what reputation is. So it's kind of a collection of things that others might say about us. Now, the seminal writer in terms of reputation is Thombrun, who had an article published in Harvard Business Review originally in the 90s, but he bases his theory around these kind of 4 different elements. So social image, where we're thinking about our wider kind of community responsibility, financial image in terms of shareholders and investors, product image in terms of the experience that the customer gets, and then recruitment image, thinking about the people who work for us. So if we think about elements of brand equity, there's definitely some overlap in terms of perceived quality and the kind of product image, loyalty in terms of getting customers to come back to us and what the implications are there, and equity in the sense that equity has a huge impact on our financial image. So whether there is some kind of intangible asset around our brand and how that then feeds into our financial image and subsequently our reputation. One of the factors that you need to draw out whenever you're talking about reputation, so specifically thinking about the exam, but also thinking about your assignment, is the idea that we're thinking about a wider group of stakeholders beyond the customer. So often when we talk about brand and brand equity, we're kind of really focused on the customer and our customer interactions. But as you can see from Brun's quote and the idea that he talks about this social, financial and recruitment image on top of product, you can see that we're actually appealing to a wider range of stakeholders. So we're not just talking about the customer, we're thinking about the people that work for us, the people that invest in us or our shareholders, and then that impact that we have on the wider community. So reputation kind of goes a little bit further than brand in the sense that it's our kind of perceptions that are held amongst a wider group of publics and stakeholders. Now, if we look at von Brum's original model, we can see that he's talking about these 4 different areas that feed into a good corporate reputation, and it's kind of neutral, so it feeds backwards and forwards in terms of perceptions. The 4 areas actually link into 4 different kind of groups of stakeholders, if you like. So when we talk about credibility, this is credibility in terms of our financial performance. So we tend to think of our investors here. Reliability is around the product and on product performance. So again, thinking about customers. Responsibility is our wider responsibility to the community. So it feeds into that social image and what's going on in terms of our societal impact. And then trustworthiness is around the people that work for us. So, are we a trustworthy employer? Are we somewhere that people want to come and work and stay? Are we able to retain and attract talent, which can be really important in terms of being successful as an organisation? So reputation overall, you can see on this model that we are looking at that wider range of stakeholders, and that actually von Brum is arguing that our good corporate reputation is made up of our relationships between these different stakeholders and the way that they perceive us and the way that they see us. So why is reputation important? Why is it something we're even thinking about? So I'm sure you've come across this module earlier in your course, perhaps in strategic approaches to marketing with Scott last year and John. What we're talking about here is having that source of sustainable competitive advantage. So something that makes us different, but different in a way that customers are interested in, is relevant to them, and is also difficult to replicate. So if we're kind of in business always searching for that factor that makes us both different in a way that's relevant to customers and something that's difficult to imitate, then reputation has a really important role here. It can be a really great source of sustainable competitive advantage, simply because it's sustainable in the sense that it's really hard for our competitors to copy. You know, how can you copy an organisation's reputation? You can't do that yourself without building it up for a long period of time. Which is obviously not easy and is resources intensive, so it then becomes a barrier to entry in a particular marketplace. So this is really important. Fundamentally, this is what the module is about. We use brand and reputation to create a sustainable competitive advantage. And when you're talking about brands and reputation and their relevance and importance, always remember that. So it's a really important point that you need to draw out in your exam answers too. So, obviously, creating and maintaining a reputation is something that isn't resource free. It's fairly resource intensive. It costs us something as an organisation. So why do we bother? And you can see really the 4 areas that we've got here feed into those different areas in terms of the von Braun diagram. So, you know, when we talked about it being mutual, it kind of feeds backwards and forwards. It's not just about creating reputation, but it's also creates reputational benefits for organisations too. So obviously from a customer point of view, we're looking to generate loyalty. We know that at the very top of brand equity is this generation of loyal customers, which we'll cover in the next lecture. So from a customer point of view, there are huge benefits to having those really loyal customers, and also avoids customers that might create problems with us. So if we have a poor reputation for perhaps the way we behave in terms of paying taxes or our environmental impact, then that can be problematic for us and it can cause friction with regulators as well. So one of the things we're equally looking to do is have a kind of smooth and effective relationship with our community, and in particular regulators and government, who again are, you know, in stakeholder terms can be high power in some industries. You know, if you work in an organisation that's in a heavily regulated industry like financial services or legal services, then having a good relationship with those regulators is going to be really important. We can attract and keep the most talented employees, which again is really important, isn't it? If we're going to be successful as an organisation, we want to have the best people working for us, and we want to reduce the cost of things like staff turnover as well. Now, equally, having that credibility from a financial perspective means that if we need to attract investors, then we can do that, and we're able to pump money into our organisation where needed, that we're able to keep our shareholders on board. So there are some organisations that continually reinvest in their brands. So, for example, Amazon, where they don't give a huge amount of money to shareholders, but keep reinvesting in how the company operates. And to do that, we've got to have credibility. So shareholders will want to know that at some point they will get a return on their investment, and the value of their investment is increasing. So we need to have a credible reputation. Okay, so what kind of things influence our reputation? Well, Roper and Phil argue that some of the elements that influence our reputation are outside of the organisation. So this could be kind of like your general pestle factors, so changes in social behaviour, demographics, changes in you know, what we deem to be acceptable or unacceptable as society, political changes, legal changes, can all have an impact on our reputation. So, you know, whatever is going on outside the organisation can influence the way we're perceived. If we're associated with a particular type of behaviour, for example, not paying our taxes as an organisation or engaging in tax avoidance, and that becomes deemed socially unacceptable from brands, then that obviously can have an impact on the way that we're perceived. They also have this, they have a second element of relational. This is kind of contextual, I think, context is what really they're talking about. So this idea that if your particular sector that you operate in is generally perceived badly, then this can have an impact on your reputation. Even if as an organisation it's not something that you're engaging in, it's a little bit like all organisations being tarnished with the same brush, if you like. So the financial services banking industry is a good example of this. So, you know, if you think about the economic crisis in relation to kind of subprime lending, lots of banks received a bad press and had a kind of outcome of a poor reputational image as a result of that, whether or not they were engaged in the practice. And then clearly there are things that go on within our organisation that can be problematic. So, you know, not being able to protect data and having data leaks, customer information leaks, so if systems aren't robust enough, changes in GDPR, which then have an impact, and we don't potentially have the systems to cope with that. So there are a number of different factors here, influencers, that can have an impact on our organisation. Some of them, clearly, like your pestel factors and the stuff going on outside the organisation, it's much more difficult for us to influence and control. What goes on inside the organisation is clearly a little bit more controllable from our perspective. So we just need to be aware of these different factors and have strategies to deal with them. We come to look at crisis management, as I said earlier, later in the module. So we're not dealing with that specifically here, but just being aware of the issues that may be presented. Come from? So Roper and Phil argue that it comes from quite a wide range of different elements within an organisation. So it can be anything from how satisfied and happy our employees are, to how innovative we are, our kind of market position, how satisfied our customers are, our level of customer service and reputation for providing excellent customer service, profitability. So there's a really wide range of different factors that help form our reputation. You'll see that a lot of what they're arguing here are things that are within our control. So they are what's going on within the organisation. So this is kind of how we create and maintain our reputation. That's not to say that things going on outside the organisation can't have an impact on that reputation once it's been formed and created. So we always need to be mindful of both what's going on inside the organisation, but equally those external factors too, in terms of what's happening outside of the organisation. Okay, so Bromley argues that we have these three different levels of reputation in terms of what we experience from a customer point of view. So at the primary level, these are kind of our own experiences and tend to be the most influential in terms of our perceptions. So what does it feel like when we interact with this organisation? What are our experiences like? At a secondary level, it's the experiences of our friends and family, peers, people that we talk to, people that we know, that we have some social capital with, and the way they perceive the organisation and the things that they say. And at a third level, it's the media, the messages the organisation sends out itself, and how they try to portray their reputation. Now, this is very similar to a model by Gronruse and Lindberg called a brand communications triangle, where they essentially propose the same theory, that there are these three different levels, with the primary level being by far the most influential, i.e. what you actually influence for yourself in terms of the perceptions you then develop. So it's important that we understand where, from a perceptual point of view, do these different levels of reputation derive from, and which are the most powerful and important. Okay, so how do these overlap? So the brand is pretty much the organisation, the company, and then its reputation surrounds that, and it includes things like the corporate values. So the values that that organisation holds important to it, what influences its decisions, and the way it operates, the way it behaves. And they are really difficult to imitate. So they're really important in terms of the way that they feed into reputation. And we're going to look at culture and values in a later lecture. It's important that, as I said earlier, we recognise that reputation incorporates this broader level of stakeholders. So we're dealing with more than one type of public. We're not just dealing with customers. We're thinking about our impact on a wider range of people, and that's where our reputation comes from. So equally is important because it can then influence our perceptions of the brand. So it might change or see that the brand specifically. It's just interesting to have a look at differences between a brand and a reputation in terms of, is it possible to be a strong brand and have a poor reputation? And that's something that's worth thinking about. And we've covered in more detail some of you already in seminar 3. So you look on this list here and you can see that there aren't, there's not a huge degree of consistency between those brands that are really strong and those brands that have a really good reputation. So Apple, for example, number 1 in terms of the strongest brand, but doesn't appear in the top 10 in terms of reputation. So start to think about why might that be? Is it just from a pure customer focus, and so they're not really thinking about that wider group of customers, or is what else is going on that potentially might cause a problem? And if Apple is still the number 1 strongest brand, does it have potential issues in terms of their longevity and their sustainability, or do we kind of think actually reputation isn't that important unless it's our source of differentiation? What is it about the Apple brand that makes it strong? Some of these brands over here, it might be that reputation is a really key part of their source of differentiation. Some other places that you can look if you want to have a look at your the reputation of your brand. So a number of different places, a number of different magazines or websites that do some kind of reputation audit to have a look at different organisations and how they perform. So Fortune magazine, the Forbes list is quite interesting. So that goes through some of the world's most valuable brands and looks at their different sort of sales, profits, looks at it from a kind of league table perspective. It's interesting that Warren Buffett would say that it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but not very long to ruin it. So if he's saying, he's making an argument, really sort of prolific investor. If you want to be successful as an organisation, you need to make sure that you're constantly thinking about your reputation, and actually what is kind of implying is it takes a long time to build up a good reputation that will be a great source of competitive advantage, but actually you can soon kind of diminish it and ruin it, and we'll see that in seminars. It's the seminar 3 activity where we look at a brand that did just that. Arlo Brady also looks at sources of reputation. So you can see, again, based on what we've looked at already, it kind of just expands some of the different areas that we've talked about in terms of von Brum's model. RepTrack is really useful. So this is a measurement tool in terms of looking at the kind of reputation of an organisation and auditing it. It's quite interesting because you can see that actually the 3 areas that it audits are based around the kind of very attitudinal model, so the think, feel, do perspective. So it kind of looks at how organisations think, what's their kind of culture, their cognitive considerations, how do they feel, so how do they act on an emotional level, and then how do they actually behave. So is their behaviour consistent with what they're thinking and feeling? Where do they invest? What kind of causes do they promote? And is that always absolutely genuine, which we've seen with some recent advertising campaigns, that sometimes it's not always perceived that well. Some of the trends from last year, and I think I showed you in the actual lecture, we looked at a useful report that I've put a link to on the Blackboard site from the Reputation Institute. And these trends sort of continue into 2019, 2020. It's becoming more and more difficult to attract people to work for your brand who are really talented and then retaining that talent. So that's something that organisations need to consider in terms of their reputation. Remember, if you're ultimately going to deliver really good sort of value for your customer, you need these talented people working for you. Those talented people might only come if you've got a good reputation. Loyalty is becoming a rarity, so achieving that kind of top of the pyramid loyalty from our consumers can actually be quite difficult. Lots of organisations need to win back trust, so we don't trust corporations anymore, and we tend to be a little bit more cynical about why they're behaving the way they are. And there's a real need to engage with millennials, and that means engagement on different levels. So social media becomes more important. That's been a key trend in the luxury brand market too. So we need to think about the way we, as an organisation, engage with our customers and stakeholders. So not just the fact that we need to engage, but how do we do that successfully? Okay, guys, so I've just whizzed through and recapped some of the key points from the lecture. Obviously, we went into those areas in more depth in the physical lecture. So reputation is important and it matters. I guess as a brand, you may maintain some sense of competitive advantage for some time with a strong brand, but reputation ultimately is important too, and it can be lost quite quickly. So we need to carefully think about the way we behave and what we do and how that potentially might impact on our reputation. Because of the sense of competitive advantage and its level of sustainability, there are some really excellent commercial advantages to maintaining and developing a really strong corporate reputation, as we've talked about in quite a lot of detail. We can measure, manage, and track our reputation, and we should look at this and benchmark it, noting what's important, what are our values, what are our goals, is our reputation achieving those for us, so we can benchmark against competitors or even kind of the best in industry or best in other industries. But it's important that we take note, we're aware of the need to be kind of conscious of where our reputation's at and where there might be potential issues, perhaps stakeholders that we're not engaging with very, very well that might be important in the future.